Hello and welcome to our fifth week of our course on Frank Lloyd Wright by Open Online Academy and Professor John Lobel. We are happy to have you back and hopefully you enjoyed our previous lectures. In this particular lecture, we'll be discussing a very important period of the life and work of Frank Lloyd Wright, and particularly the 1950s. This is one of the most productive time of his life when he was already 80 plus years old, and at that time is when he was starting to have these major commissions like the Guggenheim Museum. So I would like to ask John, what is the most important, what are the most important buildings of this period, and why Frank Lloyd Wright was able to stay relevant and to regenerate his work in this period?
So we'll start with the Guggenheim. So here we are in the 50s. We're going to see a little bit in the 40s, and we're going to do a couple of lectures here, two on the Guggenheim, one focused on structure, then other buildings, then we're going to look at Wright's tall buildings. There's something very interesting there. And we're going to see something really interesting where this looks very unusual compared to Wright's other work, but there's something very similar. And we'll see that actually in the next lecture. So here we are on Fifth Avenue in New York, and this building was criticized for being, does that fit in Manhattan, which has square buildings? And actually, in a way, it does. If we look the way it holds down the corners and it holds down the line of the street. So Wright really did know what he was doing in an urban setting. It's actually a very successful building set in New York. And its interior is iconic. It's known all over the world as this spiraling inside experience. Interestingly, you come in under a low overhang and then you explode into the space. We'll see later that's a device he's used before, for example, in Johnson Wax. Now, first thing we'll realize is this is not out of the blue. Here we are back in 1925, and Wright is doing something called an automobile objective. So in 1925, automobiles were new. You needed someplace to go. So this was a planetarium, and so inside we project the stars, and outside is this spiral ramp for the cars to drive around and park. So we already see the spiral and this kind of circular space in Wright's work some decades earlier. And here we are, 1948, and this is the Morris Gift Shop. Now, at first glance, you would say, well, this has nothing to do with the Guggenheim. Look at this flat brick facade, and look at this arch. Something out of reference back to Sullivan and Richardson, two of the great rivals of Wright's early days. And then we go inside, and there it is. So Wright's already experimenting with this spiral. So this is the Morris Gift Shop. So if you're in San Francisco, make sure it's on a side street. Make sure you catch that. And here we are in New York, the Guggenheim Museum. We'll see shortly that this addition to the museum by Gwathmey Siegel was really Wright's original intention. It should be set off and set forward against the city. So we see the strong spiral and the entrance in the center. So the story of the Guggenheim, and let's go in on that slide. Solomon R. Guggenheim was an American businessman who inherited a lot of his money, and he pursued business interests for a while, and then he began collecting art in the 1890s. After the First World War, he retired from business to be a full-time art collector, and he established what was called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which became the Guggenheim Museum. And he eventually selected Frank Lloyd Wright to design the building. Now, there's more to the story. There's this remarkable woman, Hilda Rebay, and she was born in 1890, and she was an abstract artist, and she worked with Guggenheim to establish this museum, and she was very influential on the selection of Frank Lloyd Wright. And here are the three of them, Wright, Rebay, and Solomon R. Guggenheim, with a model and museum. And what do we notice about this model? It's backwards. So he switched the main spiral and the secondary space later in the design. And actually we see there are quite a few versions of the museum. Some of them pyramiding in, some of them pyramiding out, some of them octagonal. So Wright explored a lot of ideas. It took a long time to get the land and get the permits and get this thing going. So Wright pursued a lot of variations. And here we see in one of Wright's renderings on the left that he did envision this building setting off the museum against the city. That became part of the addition done just a few years ago. Here's the plan. We'll go into that a little bit more later, but we've got a secondary space, an entrance in between, and our spiraling central space. Here it is. So there are a couple of features about the Guggenheim we want to focus in on. Here we see a wide angle of the spiral. Here we are down in the lobby, and we then get a question, which is, first of all, what's going on here in terms of the form? Notice that it gets bigger as it goes up on the outside, and then the space gets smaller as it goes in on the inside. It's a very dynamic quality to this. And then we ask, how do we show paintings? And the museum is famous for its being difficult to hang art in there because the floor is tilted, the walls are tilted. Do you line the painting up to the floor or to vertical to the center of the earth? And so that's always a problem. And Frank Lloyd Wright saw the finishing of the museum, but he died before it opened. So a couple of questions. What do you think of the Guggenheim as a place to show art? So if you're in New York, you want to be sure to visit. And if you've seen Frank Gehry's Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain, what do you think of the two buildings in comparison with each other? And next we'll talk about the structure.
So John, thank you for this wonderful lecture about the Guggenheim. And I visited the museum so many times, and it always surprises you, because the museum stays the same, but when the art changes inside, you always have a completely different perception. I saw like a few years ago an exhibit by this Italian artist Catalan from Sardinia, who instead of putting objects on the walls was hanging all the objects in the center of the building, if you remember that. No, that was a very controversial exhibit, but quite amazing. So this relationship between the museum and the artwork is always quite curious, no? And in museum there is always this this kind of controversy, like, do people go there to see the building or they go to see the actual art exhibit? And in many times, particularly in the Guggenheim museums, the art is completely overshadowed by the quality and beauty of the architecture. So I remember an anecdote that I read a few years ago about the controversy between the artists which exhibited here at the Guggenheim and Frank Lloyd Wright and Solomon Guggenheim, the patron of the museum. So basically, some of the most prominent artists, 30 of them at that time, wrote a letter to Solomon Guggenheim saying, this museum has tilted floors, the walls are tilted, it's not going to work for an art exhibit, we're never going to want to put our work in there, you have to hire a different architect, and Frank Lloyd Wright is not the way to go. So he wrote that letter to Solomon Guggenheim, and Frank Lloyd Wright got a hold of it. So he responded to those artists with an open letter saying, you know what, people one day are going to come to the museum to see my building and not your artwork, no? So you'd better be quiet and let me do my work, no?
Well, it's interesting how we see that evolve. So if we look at the Museum of Modern Art, New York's other premier institution, it's had many iterations over the decades, and one of them was beautiful galleries by Philip Johnson. I think we still miss those galleries because they were small, square, absolutely plain, and could put paintings across from each other, sort of in dialogue with each other. And for a certain size and a painting in a period of art, that's maybe what you would want. And for that kind of painting, this Guggenheim is definitely difficult. And again, as you mentioned, the floor is tilted, the walls are tilted. To what do you align the paintings? And So that's a difficulty. But now art is so often performance, large things, installations, and the fact now the Guggenheim works very well for that, particularly when you can hang it into the middle of the space. Some things work very well. There was a very controversial motorcycle show a couple of decades ago, and as you walked around the spiral, and you could walk around the motorcycles as you went up, and that worked very well. So it works better for some things than others. And then in Wright's original design, there's an area off of the spiral that's totally rectilinear. And then the new galleries by Gwathmey Siegel are totally rectilinear. So between the new galleries, which can hang the traditional art, and the great space in the center, I think people have come to be quite happy with the museum.
Interesting. And do you think that Frank Lloyd Wright envisioned that when he was designing it, or?
I doubt it. Who knew that people were going to be hanging the art from the center?
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you. We'll see more about the structure in our next lecture.
Great.